North Atlantic, 1967. Somewhere beneath this water, Soviet submarines are rehearsing for nuclear war, and NATO is running out of ways to stop them. November class, Echo class, Hotel class. Moving through the GI-UK gap in numbers NATO analysts found deeply alarming. They are not patrolling, they are practicing. Approach vectors, escape corridors, the geometry of a first strike. Canada's eastern seaboard sits directly in that geometry. Halifax, St. John, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a body of water so strategically vital that German U-boats had already proven, 20 years earlier, that an enemy willing to enter it could strangle the continent. Now the threat was nuclear, faster, quieter, and the tools built to stop it were already obsolete. A Canadian destroyer in 1967 could make 28 knots on a calm sea. A Soviet nuclear submarine could sustain 30 knots submerged and sprint to over 35. By the time a surface vessel detected a contact, calculated an intercept, and closed the distance, the target was already gone, somewhere else, somewhere darker. The Royal Canadian Navy knew this, NATO knew this, and quietly, in a shipyard on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, a small team of Canadian engineers had begun drafting an answer. Not a faster destroyer, something else entirely, something that did not just sail on the water, something that left it behind. To understand what Canada was attempting to build, you first have to understand why every conventional solution had already failed. Sonar had a brutal limitation. The faster a ship moved, the louder it became. Push a destroyer hard enough and it could barely hear the submarine it was chasing. Speed made you blind. The solution, in theory, was simple. Build something fast enough to chase a submarine, and quiet enough, when needed, to hear it. No such vessel existed. Then someone inside the Royal Canadian Navy proposed something insane. What if the ship could fly? It sounded less like naval engineering and more like science fiction. A hydrofoil works on the same principle as an aircraft wing. Underwater struts carry blade-shaped foils beneath the hull. As the vessel accelerates, water flowing over those foils generates lift. At sufficient speed, the entire hull rises clear of the surface. The drag disappears. The noise drops. The speed becomes something conventional warships simply cannot match. The concept was not new. Alexander Graham Bell had proved it on Cape Breton Island in 1919, reaching 114 kilometers per hour on a craft he called the HD-4, a world water speed record that stood for a decade. Canada had the history. For the first time, Canada had a reason to take the idea seriously. In 1963, the RCN formally launched the FHE 400 program, Fast Hydrofoil Escort, hull number 400. To a lot of naval engineers, the idea sounded insane. A 230-ton ocean-going warship sustaining foilborne flight in North Atlantic swells. But the alternative was continuing to lose the underwater geometry war, and that was no longer acceptable. The contract went to Marine Industries Limited in Sorel, Quebec. Not a famous name in naval construction, which was precisely the point. A yard unencumbered by institutional conservatism. Engineers willing to treat an impossible brief as an engineering problem, rather than a political liability. Construction began in 1965. The Bras d'Or, named for the lake system in Cape Breton where Bell had first proved the concept, would be 46 meters long. Its retractable foil system had to support 230 tons at speed, absorbing shock loads that would destroy a less rigorously engineered structure. The propulsion came from two Pratt & Whitney ST6 gas turbines, delivering enough power to push all of that steel, aluminum and weaponry to a sustained speed of 117 kilometers per hour on water. For comparison, most warships of the era couldn't reach half that speed in rough seas. No warship of comparable size anywhere in the world had ever gone that fast. The Bras d'Or was completed in 1968, and when it finally met the water, it did not disappoint. The first time the Bras d'Or lifted clear of the water, the men on deck felt it before they understood it. A shudder, a low mechanical groan as the foil struts took the load. Then the sound changed. 230 tons of warship had just left the ocean. The year was 1969. The formal sea trial program had begun on Lake St. Peter, the broad, shallow widening of the St. Lawrence between Sorel and Trois-Rivières. Controlled, measurable. The engineering team needed baseline data before they took the ship into open water, and the lake gave them the flat conditions to find it. The acceleration was violent by naval standards, from displacement mode, hull in the water, moving conventionally, The ship transitioned to foilborne flight in under 90 seconds. Once airborne, speed built with an ease that unnerved observers who had spent careers watching conventional vessels struggle past 30 knots, 40 knots, 50, 60, the hull riding 4 meters above the surface, the foils cutting clean lines through the water below, the gas turbines producing a sound closer to a jet at takeoff than anything belonging to a navy. The Bras d'Or reached roughly 63 knots, about 117 kilometers an hour during trials. That figure was not a sprint peak, it was a sustained operational speed. A Soviet November-class submarine at full emergency power could manage 30 knots submerged. The Bras d'Or could run it down at twice that speed. The tactical reality was stark. A conventional ASW destroyer had perhaps a 15-minute window after detecting a submarine before the target maneuvered beyond effective weapons range. At 63 knots, that window collapsed to minutes. The Bras d'Or could close from radar detection range, deploy its dunking sonar, classify the contact, and be in torpedo firing position before a submarine commander had finished processing the threat. It did not just change the chase, it eliminated it. The trials moved to open Atlantic waters in 1970. Every round seemed to end the same way. The ship performed better than expected, faster than expected, quieter than expected, more stable than expected. Every month, the impossible was becoming real. The engineers at Marine Industries had delivered exactly what the 1963 brief had demanded as a theoretical goal. The technology was proven. The platform worked. The program had spent approximately $10 million, a fraction of its projected budget, and achieved everything it set out to achieve. By any measure, the Bras d'Or in 1971 was a success. The Bras d'Or had a problem. It worked. In Ottawa, the Trudeau government was completing a defence review, and somewhere inside a government building that had never felt the hull lift off the water, that had never heard the turbines open up across a cold lake at dawn, a decision had already been made. The ship just didn't know it yet. October 1971. The document that ended the Bras d'Or program did not use dramatic language. It cited fiscal restraint, reallocation of defence priorities, the need to concentrate limited resources on commitments already made. Precise, bloodless, and complete. Pierre Trudeau's government looked at the project very differently than the Navy did. Admirals saw the future. Ottawa saw a bill. Trudeau had come to power sceptical of large conventional military expenditure. His 1971 Defence White Paper cut the Canadian Armed Forces budget in real terms, consolidated the service branches, and made clear that technically successful programs were not immune from cancellation. Success was the thing that killed it, because success meant production, and production meant a commitment Ottawa was not willing to make. A single prototype had cost $10 million. A full production run, the operational squadron the Navy wanted, would cost multiples of that, with no export sales to offset the investment. Canada was not the United States. It could not absorb the per-unit cost of a revolutionary weapons platform on a mid-sized NATO budget. The United States was already investing heavily in hydrofoil research of its own, and countries rarely pay for someone else's future. Within the RCN, the reaction was quiet devastation. The engineers from Marine Industries, the naval architect, the crew who had stood on the deck as the hull lifted and felt what the ship could do. They understood that this was not a deferral. There would be no resumption pending further review, no scaled production run. The program was closed. The budget line was gone. The Bras d'Or was sailed to CFB Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Its foils were retracted. Its turbines were shut down. It was tied to a dock and placed in care and maintenance status, the military's term for the purgatory between active service and official disposal. The crew dispersed. The engineering team moved on. The institutional knowledge that had built the ship began, quietly, to dissolve. Canada had spent a decade conceiving, designing, constructing, and proving a warship that no navy in the world had matched for speed. It had then walked away from it in a single budget cycle. It had done something very similar 13 years earlier, with an aircraft built in a factory in Moulton, Ontario. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. The Bras d'Or sat at Dartmouth for years, tied to the pier, hull intact, foils folded beneath it like a bird that had forgotten it could fly. Maintenance crews walked its decks occasionally. Nobody flew its ensign. The ship that had outrun every warship on the Atlantic was going nowhere at 0 knots, rusting quietly into a category of things Canada preferred not to discuss. Cancelled military programs rarely receive obituaries. They receive storage orders. The years after 1971 were not kind to the logic that had ended the program. Naval warfare was changing. Speed and agility, the precise qualities the Bras d'Or had been built around, were not becoming obsolete. They were becoming decisive. The Soviets and Americans both continued experimenting with high-speed hydrofoil combat craft in the years that followed. The idea Canada abandoned did not disappear. Other countries kept building toward it. Canada watched from the dock at Dartmouth. The fundamental problem the FHE 400 program had addressed never disappeared. Soviet submarine activity in the North Atlantic peaked in the early 1980s. The approaches to Canada's eastern seaboard remained exactly as strategically significant as they had been in 1967. The threat geometry had not changed. The tool built to meet it had been scrapped. The Bras d'Or was eventually towed from Dartmouth. There was brief discussion of preservation, a museum exhibit, some measure of public recognition for what the program had achieved. The discussions did not produce results. The hull was scrapped. No production vessels were ever built. No operational squadron ever formed. The foil data, the control architecture, the acoustic readings from 2 years of open-water trials, none of it fed into a successor program. The knowledge simply stopped. What remained was the record: 63 knots, one hull, 1 decade of work, and a data archive that, for a brief period, represented the leading edge of naval engineering anywhere on Earth. There is a photograph taken during the Bras d'Or's sea trials. The ship is fully foilborne. The hull hangs 4 meters above the surface, the St. Lawrence stretching flat and grey behind it, the foil struts cutting thin white lines through the water below. The spray fans out in a perfect symmetrical arc. The sky is overcast. The ship looks, in that image, less like a warship than like something that has simply decided the rules no longer apply to it. That photograph is not widely known. The ship that produced it is not widely remembered. Canada has a specific relationship with its own ambition. It conceives extraordinary things, machines that reach the edge of what contemporary engineering believes possible. And then, at the moment those things become real, it finds reasons to stop. The Avro Arrow flew in 1958 and was cancelled in 1959. The Bras d'Or flew across the water in 1969 and was cancelled in 1971. In both cases, cancellation came soon after success, before either project could mature into a full operational future. What was lost was not only a ship, it was a direction. The engineers who built the Bras d'Or carried knowledge that existed nowhere else, not in the United States, not in the Soviet Union, not in Britain. The specific combination of foil geometry, control systems, and gas turbine integration that produced 63 sustained knots in North Atlantic conditions was Canadian knowledge, built by Canadian hands, paid for with Canadian public money. When the program ended, that knowledge had nowhere to go. It did not transfer. It did not evolve. It retired with the men who held it. The $10 million spent on the Bras d'Or is a recoverable figure, inflation-adjusted, auditable, finite. The institutional knowledge lost when a program is cancelled without succession is not recoverable at any price. It has to be rebuilt from scratch, by a new generation, at full cost, with no guarantee of reaching the same destination. Other navies understood this. They kept building. Canada did not. The water off Cape Breton looks exactly the same today. Cold, grey, indifferent. It does not remember the fastest warship Canada ever built, or the moment Canada decided it no longer wanted to build things like it. But the record still exists. Most Canadians have never even heard of it. 63 knots. One ship. One country that touched the future and walked away from it. The ocean moved on. The question is whether Canada did. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking the video and subscribing to Canadian Legacy for more forgotten chapters of history. And let us know in the comments, had you ever heard of the Bras d'Or before today? Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.